David Reed was fighting to keep his eyes open as Professor Healyth droned on about interstellar quarantine rules. The four-armed Thesseran teacher stalked back and forth, pointing at a glowing holographic chart. All around David, students from a dozen different worlds scribbled notes, their various eyes and limbs laser-focused on the lesson. It had been 3 months since he'd arrived as part of the first-ever human exchange program, and the sheer variety of life here still boggled his mind. To his left sat LRA, a fellow Thesseran whose huge, shimmering compound eyes seemed to sparkle with curiosity. Behind him, the massive Bront, a hulking Kavarian, made his specially reinforced chair creak and groan. And just across the aisle, Sila's gills fluttered softly behind the humidity mask that kept her amphibious system from drying out. "Next week," Professor Healyth declared, tapping the display with a long, thin finger, "you will all participate in the hands-on final exam for your xenobiology certification." A jolt of nervous energy shot through the classroom. David finally sat up, his interest captured. A practical test sounded a whole lot better than another lecture. "This is a uniform exam administered at all Galactic Academy outposts," the professor went on. "You will be put into simulated environments designed to test your survival skills and biological knowledge. Each simulation is crafted to see how you manage stress, adapt to new surroundings, and make critical decisions under pressure." LRA's antenna twitched. She leaned in and whispered through her translator, "Have you ever taken a test like this before?" David just gave a little shrug. "Back on Earth, I got my EMT certification. We ran emergency drills all the time. It's not a big deal." Suddenly, several students swiveled to look at him. David saw them exchange weird glances. Some kind of silent conversation he wasn't part of. Professor Healyth's mandibles clicked, a gesture David had learned was her version of a smile. "The exam is completely safe. We have conducted these simulations for more than 300 years without a single incident. The scenarios are meant to be a minor challenge, not a genuine threat." "What kind of challenges?" Bront rumbled in his deep voice. "Things like shifts in temperature, changes in atmospheric composition, resource management, and monitoring your body's basic stress responses," Professor Healyth listed. "Nothing that any spacefaring species shouldn't be able to handle." For the first time since arriving, David was actually excited. He'd worked for 2 years as a paramedic in New Jersey before getting into the exchange program, so he knew a thing or two about staying calm under pressure. A controlled test in a laboratory? Honestly, it sounded like a walk in the park. "You will each be provided with basic supplies," the professor added. "Water rations, nutrient bars, a first aid kit, and an emergency communicator. The challenges will gradually increase in difficulty, but you can end the test at any time without penalty. We evaluate your performance based on your own species' biological norms, so you are not in competition with one another." Sila raised a webbed hand. "How long does it usually last?" "Generally between 1 and 2 standard days, depending on your pacing. Some finish quickly, others take their time. There's no rush," Professor Healyth answered, her gaze sweeping across the students. "Let me be perfectly clear. This is a standard part of your curriculum. Thousands of students successfully complete this test every single year." "Will we be alone?" LRA asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes. Individual isolation is necessary to get an accurate reading of your personal stress response, but rest assured, you will be under constant observation and the medical team is on standby." The professor paused for a beat. "Any further questions?" David put his hand up. Do we need to bring anything with us? No. All necessary equipment will be provided. Simply arrive at the testing center at dawn tomorrow in comfortable attire, she said, her antenna tilting toward David with a flicker of strange curiosity. I trust the human delegation has approved your participation? Yeah, they said it was fine, David answered. He'd barely glanced at the permission forms he signed. The human coordinator told him it was just a routine academic requirement, and David had been far more worried about his upcoming exam on stellar cartography. As the classroom began to empty, David picked up his datapad and made for the door. LRA cut him off before he could get far, her strange sideways shuffle closing the distance between them. David, she whispered, her voice low as she glanced around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. I have to ask you something. Sure, LRA, what's up? Her enormous compound eyes seemed to be studying him with a new, unsettling intensity. Is it really true, what they all whisper about your planet? David leaned back against a locker. And what exactly is everyone whispering? Well, she hesitated, the official records classify it as a Class 12 death world, but the gossip is that the classification is an understatement. David couldn't help but laugh. Or maybe it's not as bad as they make it sound. I mean, yeah, we've got some wild weather and a couple of big predators, but humans have been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. We're pretty resilient. Resilient? LRA echoed softly. Yes, I imagine you'd have to be. She reached out and gently touched his arm with one of her slender limbs. Just be safe tomorrow, David. Even routine procedures can have unexpected outcomes. Don't you worry, I'll be fine, David replied with a confident smile. How bad can it be? As he strolled toward his dorm, David was oblivious to the way the other students parted to give him a wide berth, and he missed the look of profound concern on LRA's face as she watched him disappear down the hall. The testing facility was a huge, sterile white labyrinth of corridors and observation decks. David followed the signs to his designated chamber, walking past other students who all looked like they were about to be sick with nerves. A lanky medical tech with far too many joints in its arms met him at the door. David Reed, the human exchange student? That's me. The technician's eye stalks rotated, giving him a complete scan. Remarkable. Truly remarkable. Please, step inside Chamber 17. Your supplies are waiting for you. The room was a small 10 by 10 foot cube with blank white walls that could likely project any environment imaginable. A simple cot sat in the center, and on a shelf near the door lay the promised gear. There were 3 bottles of water, a box of protein bars, a first aid kit, and a small device with a large red emergency button. David plopped down on the cot and waited. A calm, synthesized voice echoed from a speaker in the ceiling. Examination commencing. Phase 1, thermal regulation. Please remain calm and seated. The temperature inside the room slowly started to climb. David shrugged off his jacket. After a few minutes, the air went from warm to hot, reminding him of a typical summer day back in Jersey. He was so unfazed that he pulled out his tablet and started reading a novel he'd been wanting to finish. After about 20 minutes, the temperature stabilized. David hardly even noticed. He was used to those muggy, sticky East Coast summers that felt like you were breathing soup. This dry heat was actually a pleasant change. But up in the observation center 3 floors above, Professor Helleth was staring at David's vital signs in utter disbelief. The ambient temperature in chamber 17 had reached a point that would trigger severe distress in almost every known species. But David's heart rate was holding at a relaxed 68 beats per minute. His breathing was slow and steady. He was just casually flipping through a book. "Are you certain the monitoring equipment is functioning correctly?" Professor Helleth demanded of the technician. "Yes, Professor. All sensors are operating within normal parameters. The human, he appears to be completely at ease." Meanwhile, in the chamber next to his, Sela had already slammed her emergency button. The lack of humidity was causing her amphibious skin to crack. And 2 rooms over, the giant Bront was panting heavily, his massive body struggling to shed the excess heat. David just turned a page on his tablet, completely absorbed in his story. Then, the calm voice spoke again. "Phase 2. Atmospheric adjustment. Please continue to breathe as you normally would." The air suddenly felt a bit thinner, like being way up in the mountains. He'd gone hiking in Colorado once and recalled the sensation of needing to pull in slightly deeper breaths. He adapted instantly without even thinking about it. "Huh," he said to himself. "Feels like Denver in here." In the observation room, red lights began to flash across the main console. The oxygen level in David's chamber had been reduced by 15%, a drop that should have caused severe respiratory distress. "His blood oxygen saturation is still at 97%, the technician shrieked, its translated voice buzzing with shock. "That's impossible in this kind of atmosphere." Professor Helleth frantically pulled up David's file. It was stark. Homeworld, Earth, classification, Class 12, Deathworld, standard sea level atmospheric pressure 101.3 kilopascals, oxygen concentration 21%. She double-checked the calculations, positive there had to be an error. But the math was correct. Humans had evolved in an atmosphere that was essentially a corrosive poison to the majority of other species in the galaxy. The air David breathed every day was so dangerously rich with oxygen, it would cause cellular decay in most aliens. By lowering it by 15%, they hadn't made the test harder for him. They had accidentally created what the Galactic Academy considered the perfect, safest, and most comfortable breathing environment possible. What happens when you stick a guy from a planet everyone writes off as a backwater into the galaxy's most brutal entrance exam? You're about to see, and trust me, you are going to want to see how this ends. It all kicked off with test number 3. A low oxygen simulation. A calm voice announced the pressure was dropping, and while most of the other applicants were starting to gasp, David just felt his ears pop like he was on an airplane. He cleared them with a little yawn and went right back to his book. Right as David was mid-yawn, the student in Chamber 9, a lanky brawn from a low-gravity world, just folded and collapsed. Medics rushed in. His body simply wasn't built to handle the kind of atmospheric shifts humans on Earth experience just driving up a mountain. And that's when Professor Helleth, the lead examiner, made a decision that changed the whole game. "Switch him to the advanced protocols," she commanded. The four-eyed technician spun around in his chair. "Professor, with all due respect, those are designed for species from lethal environment worlds. They aren't on the standard evaluation list." "I'm aware," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Do it." Meanwhile, David turned a page, stretched his arms, and figured this whole exam was less stressful than a quiet Tuesday shift back at the hospital. He was genuinely starting to wonder when the challenging part was going to begin. "Announcing the next scenario," the automated voice said. Environmental irritant exposure. This test is optional. You may decline without penalty. Nah, I'm game, David called out to the ceiling. Bring it on. A second later, a fine mist began to spray into the room, smelling like a nasty combination of industrial bleach and pepper spray. His eyes started to sting a little, and he let out a sneeze, then another one. Whew, that's some strong stuff, he commented, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Reminds me of the cleaning solution we used to sterilize the ER. But on the other side of the observation glass, the monitors were showing atmospheric toxin levels that should have sent David into respiratory arrest. Instead, he just sneezed a third time and mumbled something about cracking a window. Professor Heath's eyes were wide as she stared at the data streaming across her monitor. David's biology was neutralizing poisons that would instantly kill almost every known life form in the galaxy. Sure, his nose was a little runny, but his lung function was perfectly normal. The technician leaned over and whispered, "Professor, what in the 7 systems is he?" Professor Heath didn't have a clue. All she could think was that labeling planet Earth a Class 12 hazard zone might have been the biggest understatement in the history of the Galactic Federation. She immediately called an emergency meeting with the Academy Director and the Human Exchange Program Coordinator. The three of them sat in a sealed conference room, rewatching the footage of David casually acing every test they threw at him. "We have to pull him out," said Director Prass, his crystalline form shimmering with anxiety. "This human is operating far outside of all expected parameters. He volunteered for every single test," the human coordinator Rachel Kim countered with a smirk. "And according to your own data, his vital signs are perfect." "That's precisely the problem," Professor Heath shot back, pointing at the screen. "Your species seems to possess biological tolerances that make a mockery of our most extreme simulations. We designed these scenarios based on data from 3,000 different species across more than 1,200 worlds. David is treating life or death situations like they're a minor inconvenience." Rachel just gave a little shrug. "Earth can be a pretty intense place. You either learn to adapt or you don't last long." "Your planet is a Class 12 death world," Director Prass retorted. 98% of all spacefaring species would require a full environmental hazard suit just to take a breath of what you people call fresh air." "So what you're saying is, David's passing the test," Rachel said coolly. "I fail to see the issue." Professor Heath brought up a new chart on the main screen. This graph shows David's stress hormone levels compared to the average applicant. Notice anything unusual? Rachel looked. David's line was so flat it looked like a mistake, while every other line on the graph shot up like a rocket. "He's relaxed," she said. "Isn't that a good quality in a candidate?" "He shouldn't be relaxed. He should be in a state of profound physiological distress." The professor highlighted another data set. The toxin screening. At this concentration, his central nervous system should be shutting down. Instead, David sneezed. "Humans sneeze when something irritates our nasal passages," Rachel explained, as if to a child. "It's a protective biological reflex." "Protective," Director Prass repeated, the word tasting strange. "Yes, I'm beginning to realize that your definition of protective and ours are two vastly different concepts." Despite their serious reservations, they agreed to let the test proceed, but under much closer observation. They informed David that the next phase would be significantly more intense and offered him one last chance to withdraw. He just laughed it off. "Honestly, this is all pretty fascinating," he said, looking up at the chamber's observation camera. I've never had a physical this detailed before. The following test involved a simulated battlefield injury. They presented him with a hyper-realistic prosthetic arm that had a gruesome-looking wound, along with a standard-issue first aid kit. The objective was to assess a student's psychological reaction to severe trauma and their ability to function under pressure. Most applicants turned green just looking at the thing. In fact, a large number of students simply refused to participate in this part of the exam. But David, who used to be an emergency medical technician, approached it like a routine training drill. All right, let's see what we've got. First rule, stop the bleed, he murmured to himself, completely unaware that his every word was being recorded. Direct pressure. Elevate the limb, no arterial spray, that's a good sign. Next, we got to clean it out. Make sure there's no debris in the wound. Oh, good, this kit has some antiseptic wipes. Now, we wrap it. Tight enough to maintain pressure, but not so tight we cut off circulation to the rest of the arm. He finished the entire procedure in under 4 minutes. The galactic average for those who didn't faint was 18 minutes. He's narrating it, Professor Healyth said, her voice filled with awe. He's teaching the proper medical procedure while being evaluated under extreme stress, she clarified in total disbelief. David worked in an emergency room on Earth, Rachel explained quietly. This is literally what he used to do every day. Your people train their civilians for this kind of trauma? The director asked. We train a lot of people for a lot of things. You never know when you'll need to save someone's life. That simple statement hung in the air with the weight of a collapsing star. A species that dealt with so much physical trauma that they taught advanced first aid as a basic life skill. A world so hostile that patching up a horrifying injury was considered common knowledge. They moved on. The next test was food deprivation. After just 18 hours, most of the other students were showing signs of significant mental and physical fatigue. By the 40-hour mark, several applicants had to be removed for medical intervention. David, on the other hand, casually remarked that he sometimes gets so busy at work he forgets to eat lunch, and then he just kept on going. His body was efficiently burning through energy reserves that had evolved in a species that once hunted by literally chasing its prey until the animal collapsed from sheer exhaustion. What is the maximum survival time for a human without food? Director Prass asked Rachel, his voice low. It varies, but with access to water, a healthy adult can go for a few weeks. We're pretty good at conserving energy. A few weeks? Professor Helleth whispered, horrified. Most known species begin to experience catastrophic organ failure after 5 to 7 days. Yeah, humans are tough to kill, Rachel said with a hint of pride. It's kind of our thing. At that same moment, in her dorm across the campus, another student named Laura had managed to hack into the live observation feed. She watched David's incredible data scroll across her screen, making her own impressive test scores from the previous year look like a joke. The numbers simply didn't add up. David wasn't just surviving in conditions they labeled extreme hazard. He was thriving. He was relaxing in environments their charts marked as categorically unsurvivable. And his vital signs showed that he wasn't even close to being stressed. Ellara pulled up the official galactic file on planet Earth, Class 12, Deathworld. It listed vicious predators, chaotic weather patterns, constant seismic activity, high gravity, intense solar radiation, and a greater number of deadly microorganisms than a top-level bioweapons facility. And humans had the audacity to call this nightmare home. They didn't just endure it. They had picnics there. They built sprawling cities on that fundamentally unstable rock. They had evolved to perceive a living hell as just normal. She thought about David's easy smile and the way he was always offering to help the other students with their coursework. This creature, who was forged in a crucible that would kill her in a matter of minutes, was a genuinely kind and gentle person. Laura closed the files and sat there in the dark, trying to process the monumental implications of having humanity join the galactic community. Back in the observation room, the senior faculty had gathered for the final and most controversial test. Professor Helleth had insisted they administer the pain tolerance exam over the director's strenuous objections. The data is too valuable to ignore, she had argued. This is a standard part of the advanced protocol. We administer controlled electrical impulses at incrementally increasing levels. Most species voluntarily withdraw at level 3. Level 5 is classified as extreme duress. Level 7 is known to induce a severe psychological trauma response, she went on. In the entire history of this academy, no applicant has ever proceeded past level 8. Down in the testing chamber, David sat patiently with electrodes attached to his arm. An automated voice explained that he could say the word "stop" at any point to end the test. The final trial was about to start. "Ready when you are," David called out with a cheerful grin. Level 1 began. It felt like a tiny spark of static electricity. David acknowledged he could feel it, but his vital signs remained perfectly stable. Level 2 was a more distinct jolt, like quickly touching a hot stove. His heart rate didn't change at all. Then came Level 3, the exact point where nearly every other species in the known galaxy quit. Can you imagine being subjected to a pain test so severe it would make a battle-hardened warrior cry out, only to find it slightly annoying? For David, this was just another part of the physical. He frowned a little. "Okay, that's a bit uncomfortable," he reported, "but it's not terrible. I'd call it a 4 out of 10. The alien staff exchanged looks of pure disbelief. David's jaw tightened slightly, but the thought of stopping didn't even cross his mind. "Proceeding to level 5, the technician announced. This intensity of pain was specifically engineered to cause severe distress in nearly every species they had ever documented. David just took a long, slow breath. "Yep, I can definitely feel that one," he said, nodding. "Feels like a really bad leg cramp." Professor Helleth leaned forward, her 4 eyes glued to the biometric displays. The pain signals were absolutely firing in David's nervous system. His brain was receiving the input, but his body's physiological stress response was almost non-existent, and he was voluntarily asking for more. "Level 6, the technician said, glancing at Professor Helleth for approval before pressing the button. She gave a firm nod. David couldn't help but let out a little hiss of pain. "Okay, yep, that one's got a bite," he chuckled. "Feels like the time I snapped my finger playing ball in high school." Director Pratt looked absolutely aghast. "You suffered a compound fracture and continued to engage in a recreational activity?" From the observation deck, Rachel just smirked. "You tape it up, man, it's just a finger." They were only on level 7. Now this particular level was officially classified as torture by most galactic species. Some even used it for capital punishment. A sheen of sweat popped on David's forehead, and he grit his teeth, but he didn't say stop. "Hey, you sure this machine is calibrated right?" he asked, his voice strained. "I mean, don't get me wrong, it stings, but the way you guys talked it up, I was expecting way more." The entire room of alien technicians was dead silent. The human was questioning if their torture simulator was strong enough. "The equipment is functioning within normal parameters," a technician finally managed to say. Do you wish to proceed to level 8? "Might as well," David shrugged. "Let's see what it's got." The indicator light blinked. David's hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist. His breath caught in his throat. and for the very first time they saw raw, undiluted pain written all over his face. He held on for a full 10 seconds before blowing out a sharp breath. "All right, yeah, that's a rough one. I think I'm good. You guys should have plenty of data from that, right?" Professor Helleth didn't even realize she'd been holding her breath. David had just voluntarily withstood an agony that would make a battle-hardened Krogan pass out, and he didn't quit because he couldn't take it. He quit because he thought they were finished. The temperature trials were next. They plunged the chamber to a cold that should have triggered immediate hypothermia. Instead, David's body just started to shiver, a strange automatic response where his muscles contracted to generate their own heat. He admitted it was chilly, but he was completely fine. The heat tests were pretty much the same story. David simply began to sweat, with little beads of liquid appearing on his skin to cool him down. The alien students who were watching the recording were completely baffled by this. Their species had to physically alter their surroundings to manage their body temperature. Humans, on the other hand, just leaked. "That is deeply unsettling," Scylla whispered to her friend Lara in the student lounge. "They secrete fluids." "They do not leak," Lara corrected, though she was just as weirded out. "It's a biological process for thermoregulation, and a very efficient one, it seems." The final portion of the examination was all about physical endurance. They had David perform simple tasks until he hit his limit: walking, climbing, lifting, just basic stuff. 1 hour in, he was barely winded. 2 hours in, the staff were getting tired just from watching him. After 3 solid hours, David was soaked in sweat but showed zero signs of stopping. "Hey, is this an open-ended thing?" he called out, his breathing steady. "Because I can go all day if you need to collect more readings." Professor Helleth looked at the monitors. His muscles were firing under strain, but he was nowhere near his breaking point. His heart and lungs were working overtime, but at a pace he could clearly maintain for hours. His entire body was a machine built for persistence, a product of evolution designed to run prey into the ground over vast distances. "You may cease the exercise, David," Professor Helleth announced. "We have acquired sufficient data." David stopped and did a quick cool-down stretch. "Awesome," he said. "That was a pretty good workout. So do you guys have a weight room or something on this station? I'm trying to get back on a regular schedule." The sheer concept of purposely putting your own body through hell for some kind of health benefit was so foreign, so utterly bizarre, that several of the alien observers needed the idea explained multiple times before they could even begin to process it. "Humans intentionally damage their muscle fibers so they regenerate stronger," Rachel explained calmly. "We constantly push our cardiovascular systems to their breaking point to improve their efficiency. We call it training. Your species has weaponized self-inflicted harm as a form of maintenance," Director Prass said, looking a little green. Rachel just grinned. "We call it getting swole." David was given a break to recover. His medical scans showed minor muscle inflammation, thousands of microscopic tears that were already beginning to repair themselves. Incredibly, his healing rate was faster than any species they had on file. It was as if his immune system was so hyper-aggressive, so accustomed to dealing with constant physical trauma, that it was always on high alert. While David relaxed, Professor Helleth drafted her initial report. The human hadn't just met their standards. He didn't just break their records, he made them look like a joke. He treated their most grueling tests like they were a minor annoyance, and he remained polite and good-humored through the whole thing. Earth wasn't a Class 12 death world. It was in a category all its own, and humanity was its terrifying proof. David was in the debriefing room, sipping a bottle of water and filling out a post-test survey. He listed most of the tests as moderately difficult and noted that the pain simulator was interesting, but not much worse than a really tough leg day. Professor Helleth entered the room to discuss the results with him when, without warning, The entire station was flooded with blaring alarms and flashing red lights. A calm, automated voice echoed from the ceiling. Containment failure detected in the xenobiology laboratory. All personnel, please initiate lockdown procedures. Hazardous material teams report to Section 7. The door to their room hissed shut, its magnetic locks engaging with a heavy thud. Through the reinforced window, David could see students and staff running for cover, their faces filled with panic. Professor Helleth's antennae went rigid with sheer terror. "What kind of containment failure are we talking about?" David asked, his emergency response training immediately taking over. "Unknown," she stammered, her voice shaking. "The xenobiology lab contains specimens from exceptionally hostile worlds. Some are weaponized plagues, others are apex predators." She hurried to the comms panel. "We should be secure in here. This room is a hermetically sealed environment." At that exact moment, a loud grinding sound echoed from inside the walls, followed by a long hiss. The station's complex ventilation system groaned to a stop. "That doesn't sound good," he remarked. Professor Helleth was frantically checking the room's environmental readouts, her mandibles chattering with anxiety. "The breach has affected life support. We're losing temperature control. Atmospheric recyclers are offline." As she said it, David could feel the air in the room begin to shift. The carefully balanced atmosphere, designed to support dozens of different life forms, was breaking down. And to top it off, just before the vents shut down, the escaped creature had released a massive cloud of spores into the system. All over the station, aliens began to panic as the air turned deadly for them. A massive creature named Bront collapsed in the corridor, his enormous frame unable to cope with the rapid drop in temperature. Scylla began to gasp as the humidity was sucked out of the air. One by one, the station's residents started to succumb to an environment that was no longer built for them. David took a quick stock of the situation. His own room was stable for the moment, but he could see people collapsing right outside the door. Elara staggered by, her vibrant compound eyes already growing dim as she struggled for every breath. "Can you get this door open?" David asked the professor. "Absolutely not," Helith replied instantly. "The contaminants out there could be instantly fatal. We must await the arrival of the hazmat teams." "And how long is that going to take?" he pushed. "They need to identify the agent, don their equipment, and formulate a strategy. Perhaps 20 minutes. David looked back at Laura, who had now crumpled against the opposite wall. She didn't have 20 minutes. He could see her body shutting down in an atmosphere that had become poison to her. "I'm going out there," David said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will perish," Professor Helleth stated as if it were a simple fact. "The organism is a parasitic fungus from a Class 9 death world. Unprotected exposure is a guaranteed death sentence." But David was already at the door panel. His training as a paramedic had one simple rule: don't become a casualty yourself. But as he watched Lara and the others dying in the hallway, he made a different calculation. "Override the lock," he ordered. "I'm not authorized to—" "Professor," David cut in, "either you open this door or I'm going to make a new one through this wall. It's your choice." Something in his tone, a quiet and absolute certainty, made her comply. The door hissed open. David stepped into the chaos. The air was all wrong. It smelled thick and earthy like a damp, rotting forest. The temperature had plummeted to a level that was probably lethal for most of the station's inhabitants. To David, it felt like a cool autumn morning in New Jersey. He reached Elra first, feeling for a pulse. It was faint and thready, her skin ice cold. He gently lifted her into his arms and carried her to a small alcove that seemed less exposed. "Hang on," he told her quietly. "Just try to breathe." Laura's eyes fluttered, trying to focus on him. "David, the spores, you're breathing them in." "We'll worry about me later," he said, already heading back into the hallway to find more survivors. Bront was far too massive to move, but David quickly cleared his airway and put him in the recovery position. He spotted a small student made of crystal, whose body was fracturing from the sudden change in temperature. David immediately took off his own jacket and gently wrapped it around her to keep her insulated. With every breath, the air felt heavier as he inhaled alien spores that tried to latch onto his lungs. But his immune system, honed by millennia of fighting off Earth's countless microbes, instantly flagged the foreign cells as a threat and declared total war. As his core temperature began to rise, his body's defenses roared to life. The alien spores, which had evolved to thrive in the cooler biology of most other species, were suddenly trapped inside a blazing furnace. They began to cook and die off, but David was completely oblivious. He was far too focused on the chaos around him, trying to figure out which of the fallen students needed his help the most. His forgotten EMT training kicked in like muscle memory, a calm voice guiding him through the panic. Check the airway, listen for breathing, find a pulse. He worked methodically, stop the bleeding, treat for shock. When the hazmat team finally stomped in, looking like oversized marshmallows in their sealed suits, they found David kneeling beside a young alien girl, calmly reassuring her. "You're doing amazing," he said, his voice perfectly steady. "Help is here. Just try to stay with me, all right?" The leader of the hazmat team stopped dead in his tracks, staring at this human, this completely unprotected human, operating in the middle of a toxic hot zone. David had been breathing this air for more than 10 minutes. By all rights, he should have been unconscious on the floor like everyone else. Instead, he was the one giving first aid. "Sir, you need to leave this area right now." The team leader's voice crackled with urgency over the comms. "Almost done," David replied, not even glancing up. "She needs fluids and a thermal blanket. That big fella over there is out cold and needs to be carried. The crystal student is stable, but she has some hairline cracks." The leader tried again. "Sir, you have been exposed to a Class 9 fungal agent." David finally looked at him. "Yeah, I got that. I'll get scanned as soon as everyone else is safe." Spurred into action, the hazmat team moved with a new sense of purpose, prepping the injured students to be moved. David was the very last person to leave, doing one final sweep to make sure no one was left behind. In the medical bay, doctors surrounded him, running scans that left them utterly speechless. The spores inside his lungs were completely neutralized, not just dormant, but totally annihilated. His immune system had waged and won a silent, brutal war in a matter of minutes, leaving no prisoners. 3 days later, David stood before the Galactic Academy's board of directors. The chamber was massive, designed to comfortably seat 50 different alien species, and he felt like a bug in a jar. He wore his dress uniform and tried not to fidget as the board members studied him like some impossible riddle. Chancellor Dreth, a wise, ancient being whose crystalline body refracted the light into beautiful rainbows, was the first to speak. "David Reed of Earth," his voice echoed, "you have undergone our standard entrance exam, and you have also been involved in a campus-wide emergency. The board has reviewed the data from both events, and we have several questions for you." "I'll answer whatever I can, sir," David replied. Professor Helleth then projected a hologram showing a clip from David's physical stress test. "In this segment, you remained conscious at temperatures that caused all other applicants to pass out," the professor observed. "How do you explain this?" David just shrugged his shoulders. "Earth has some pretty hot places. I guess you just adapt. We sweat to cool ourselves down. It works pretty well." "You release liquid from your skin?" one of the board members asked, looking horrified. "Yep," David said. "Evaporative cooling. It's a neat trick." The hologram then showed the low oxygen portion of the test. "Here you continued to function in an atmosphere that should have made you pass out." What is the typical oxygen percentage for your species? It's about 21% at sea level, David said. But we live on high mountains, in cities built way up in the thin air. Our bodies are pretty good at adjusting. Several board members began taking notes at a frantic pace. Chancellor Dreth spoke again. During the pain tolerance exam, you voluntarily continued the test to level 8. Most species lose consciousness at level 7. For what reason? Well, the instructions said that part was optional, David explained. I just thought the more information you had, the better, so I just kept hitting the button until it started to get uncomfortable. He paused for a moment, then added, "Wait, was I not supposed to do that?" "No," Professor Helleth said, his voice now much softer. "It was simply unexpected." "How did your species develop such a powerful resistance to pain?" Another member chimed in. David had to think about that one. "I guess it's just a part of our lives. I've broken bones playing games, gotten scrapes and cuts at work, rolled my ankle on a simple walk. Stuff happens. You learn to deal with it." A quiet, invisible wave of understanding seemed to ripple through the board members. At last, the Chancellor displayed a file simply labeled Earth. Your planet is officially designated as a Class 12 death world. However, after reviewing this new information, we have determined that classification is dangerously inaccurate. David's heart sank. This was it. They were going to expel him and probably ban humanity from ever applying again. Earth, the Chancellor declared, should be reclassified as a Class 15 at minimum. He began to list the reasons why. Its gravitational pull is extreme, its atmosphere is a toxic soup of gases, the weather patterns are chaotically violent, the local animals include predators that would be considered biological weapons on almost any other world. The planet itself is geologically unstable and is constantly bombarded with what should be lethal amounts of solar radiation. David was stunned into silence. "I mean, it's really not that bad once you get used to it," he said meekly. "You get used to it?" a board member whispered, completely dumbfounded. "To a human, a Class 15 death world is just home." "We've been living there for a long time," David said. "A few 100,000 years, more or less. We evolved to survive the place." Chancellor Dreth leaned closer. "During the biohazard event, you were exposed to a pathogen with a 100% kill rate. And yet you showed no symptoms. Our medical scans confirm your immune system completely destroyed it. How is that possible?" "I honestly have no idea," David admitted. "My body just handled it. I didn't even notice anything was wrong." "You have an immune system that can defeat a top-tier bioweapon without any outside help." David shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "So, is that not normal?" "It is profoundly abnormal," the Chancellor stated. "Most species in this room require a lifetime of shots and shields just to handle Class 3 microbes. You defeated a Class 9 while you were busy saving other people." "They were hurt," David said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "When someone is hurt, you help them." The board sat in complete silence for a solid minute. Then, a tiny insect-like member spoke up. "We also analyzed the contents of the human's personal tablet. It has many pictures of a creature he calls a dog, which he keeps as a pet." "Oh yeah, that's my dog, buddy. He's a golden retriever," David said with a smile. The member went on. "Our archives indicate that these dogs evolved from your planet's ancient apex predators, wolves. Fierce pack hunters that used to hunt prey 10 times their own weight." "Well, sure," David said, "but we domesticated them thousands of years ago. Now they're mostly just big, friendly goofballs. We call them man's best friend." "You tamed your world's most dangerous predators, and you keep them in your homes for fun?" "They're good boys," David insisted, feeling a sudden need to defend the honor of dogs everywhere. Another board member pulled up a picture from David's file. And what about this? An activity you call rock climbing. It appears you are climbing a sheer cliff without any technology to help you fly. Oh, that's just a hobby. It's great fun. Fun, the member repeated, as if the word was alien to him. You willingly risk falling to your death for entertainment. Well, you're supposed to use ropes and safety gear, David clarified. Most of the time. The entire board looked like it was about to short circuit. Chancellor Dreth cleared his throat, pulling up a final document. This board was assembled to decide if humanity is too great a danger to be admitted to this academy. David's heart plunged into his stomach again. After an exhaustive review, the Chancellor said, his voice now booming with authority, we have concluded that while you are indeed the product of a terrifying world, you are not dangerous. You are, in fact, the opposite. You are guardians. Earth's harsh conditions did not forge a race of ruthless conquerors. It forged a race of survivors who learned that compassion and teamwork are the greatest strengths of all. He looked David right in the eye. In a moment of crisis, your first thought was not to save yourself, but to save everyone else. It seems humanity was forged in fire, not to be a weapon, but to be a shield. The wave of relief that crashed over David was indescribable. For that reason, the Human Exchange Program will be expanded, starting today. We are officially asking for more human applicants to join our emergency rescue teams, our hazardous environment units, and our deep space exploration fleets. Your species is simply too resilient and too valuable for the galactic community to overlook. A little later, Professor Helleth found him in the hallway. Your bravery today has completely changed how we view your people. We used to see humans as monsters from a nightmare planet, the professor confessed. We were so wrong. You're protectors. David just smiled. We're just people, Professor. Our home world made us tough, but it also taught us that the most important thing is to look out for one another. That's the lesson that truly counts. That evening, he sent a video message back home, trying to explain the insane week he'd just had and how he somehow became the galaxy's poster child for what it meant to be human. Earth was a tough place to live, no doubt about it, but it had created something incredibly special.